Ruth Snyder, born Ruth Brown on March 27, 1895, was of Swedish-Norwegian descent. Born in Upper Manhattan on West 125th Street, she was the daughter of a carpenter. Ruth was raised in modest circumstances and attended local public schools. After working as a secretary, telephone operator, and salesgirl, Ruth landed a job as a stenographer with Cosmopolitan magazine in 1914. A few months after landing her job at Cosmopolitan, she met the art editor of Motorboating magazine, Albert Snyder, when she misdialed a phone call. Ruth and Albert spoke daily after this until they decided to meet. Ruth wasn't interested in the working girl life. She wanted no part of it. Albert was a successful businessman with a fine future. He was making $5,000 a year in 1914, which is equivalent to about $137,155 today. So he was doing quite well for himself, and he represented everything Ruth wanted in life. In late 1914, Ruth and Albert married. They settled into a multi-level home in Queens, New York, where Ruth became a housewife and Albert commuted to his editing job in Manhattan. Trouble started brewing early on in their marriage. Ruth would later say, "I was apparently too giddy for his years. While he was only 33 at the time, he was like a man of 50 to me." Ruth was only 19 years old at the time of her marriage, and with Albert being 12 years her senior, he was much more mature than her. Because Ruth was so young-minded when she married, and because she had such a big interest in the Manhattan party scene, it came as no surprise that she grew bored of the dutiful, obedient housewife role fairly quickly. Ruth and Albert would go on to have one child together, a daughter they named Lorraine, but even motherhood wouldn't slow Ruth down. Ruth would frequently take the subway over to Manhattan to drink and party with friends all night long and had a succession of boyfriends when Lorraine was still an infant. Ruth would later go on to say that Albert never had any idea about her affairs, and he believed she was out with her girlfriends. In June 1925, while Albert was on vacation with business associates, Ruth and her neighbor Karen decided to go shopping in Manhattan. While at lunch at a popular Swedish restaurant in Midtown named Henry's, Ruth would meet 32-year-old Henry Judd Gray through a mutual friend. He was a corset salesman, or intimate garment, as he referred to it. Gray was born in Westchester County, and he was the son of a businessman who made a sizable fortune selling jewelry. Gray was groomed to enter the business world from the time he was a child. As Ruth and Judd hung out that day at Henry's, they realized that they were both in unhappy marriages. Judd was married for 10 years at the time and was yearning for something more. Over the next few weeks, Ruth and Judd would meet frequently for lunch in Manhattan. Their first sexual experience happened in Judd's office 2 months after meeting in August. In the following months, the couple would meet in Manhattan hotel rooms and eventually form a bond that would lead them into disaster. The couple would continue the steamy affair for the next 2 years. Ruth would later confess that they went to the Imperial a few times and to the Waldorf Hotel. Ruth would even go on to admit that she brought her daughter with her on several occasions and would have her wait in the lobby of the Waldorf for several hours while she was upstairs with Judd. After a time, the couple would become even bolder and move their affair to Ruth's home while Albert was at work. Although unsure of who initially started the conversation, Ruth and Judd would later admit to having multiple conversations about how to get rid of Albert to pave the way for Ruth's marriage with Judd. And although Judd would talk about how unhappy he was in his marriage, getting rid of his wife was never discussed. Ruth would later testify in court that her and Judd would discuss ways to get rid of her husband quite often, saying, quote, "We talked about chloroform, but Mr. Gray said he didn't know if that would be sufficient enough alone." Ruth would constantly fill Judd's head with lies and exaggerations about how Albert would mistreat her and her daughter. After months of this alleged abuse, Judd grew to hate Albert, even though the two men had never met, and his entire perception of Albert was based on the fabrications that Ruth was feeding him. Ruth tried to get rid of Albert herself on many occasions. She put poison in his food, but it only made him sick. She unhooked a gas line in the kitchen and filled the house with gas while Albert was sleeping. When Ruth returned home, expecting to find her husband dead, she found him pacing up and down the front lawn, complaining of a headache instead. She tried carbon monoxide poisoning as well, but again, she was unsuccessful, and Albert never expected that his wife was trying to kill him, and even remarked to friends and neighbors that he kept having a series of unfortunate accidents. After unsuccessfully trying to murder Albert for an entire year, Ruth remarked to Judd that her husband just wouldn't die. The couple would discuss various ways to kill Albert. They originally wanted to use chloroform and bludgeon him to death in what would be staged to look like a botched robbery. But Judd was fearful that he would not be able to hold Albert down long enough to render him unconscious, since Albert was bigger and stronger than him. The couple soon came to the realization that the only way to kill Albert would be to strike him on the head with a hammer, a bat, or an iron pipe. On March 7th, 1927, Judd was drinking quite heavily and was extremely intoxicated. He would later go on to tell police that he kept drinking in an attempt to get up the courage to murder Albert. He walked the streets for 2 hours that night. He did end up going to Ruth and Albert's house that evening. Ruth spotted Judd and motioned for him to meet her in the downstairs parlor. After meeting up with Ruth, Judd let her know that he just couldn't follow through with killing Albert. The couple began to cry and hold each other for a bit before Judd got on a bus and headed back to Manhattan. The couple soon settled on another date, Saturday, March 20th, 1927. Ruth, Albert, and their daughter Lorraine had plans to go to a friend's house that night to play cards and drink. With the couple being out of the house all evening, this left plenty of time for Judd to sneak into the home and hide in Ruth and Albert's bedroom. Earlier that week, Judd had visited a hardware store where he purchased a large window sash weight, a heavy metallic object shaped like a pine cone that was used as a counterweight to open windows, and a bottle of chloroform that Ruth would hide in the bedroom she shared with her husband and the father of her child in preparation for her husband's murder. So let that sink in. Before Ruth left with her family that night, she unlocked the cellar and kitchen doors for Judd to sneak into the home. He hid in a spare bedroom where Ruth left a bottle of whiskey. Ruth was careful not to drink much at the party. At 1:35 a.m., Ruth, Albert, and Lorraine left and headed home. Once home, Albert went straight to bed, and Ruth put the couple's daughter to sleep. After putting Lorraine to bed, Ruth walked past the closet that Judd was in and whispered, "Are you there, dear?" To which Judd replied, "Yes." She told him to wait there, that she'd be back shortly. She then went into her bedroom, changed into a negligee, and slipped into bed with Albert, who was already dozing off to sleep. Ruth laid there quietly until she was sure that Albert was sound asleep. After she was sure Albert was sleeping, she went into the spare room where Judd was waiting. The couple finished the remaining whiskey together and began to encourage each other to go through with the plan. Ruth handed Judd the sash weight and a bottle of chloroform. Judd was terrified. He had never even struck a man before, let alone murder someone. Judd stood over Albert, who was sound asleep, hesitating for a moment to follow through, until finally, with Ruth standing next to him, Judd brought down the sash weight with all his strength right onto Albert's head. Judd would later tell police in a statement, "She started to fight me. She got very much excited. He got me by the necktie, and I am positive that she started to belabor him with this sash weight after that." She had the bottle of chloroform and the handkerchief, which she poured on the bed. Ruth and Judd underestimated Albert's ability to fight, so much so that Judd was unable to handle him. He called out to Ruth, "Help, Momsy! For God's sake, help me!" In later testimony, Ruth and Judd would dispute what exactly happened that night. Ruth later told the court that she could see Mr. Gray raise his arm, holding what I believe to be the weight in his hand, and in the darkness, I saw this weight in Mr. Gray's hand start to travel and immediately heard a thud, and my husband groaned twice. Judd stood firm on the fact that Ruth helped him kill Albert, a claim that she would later deny. However, what they did agree on was that while Albert lay mortally wounded and dying in the bed, Ruth and Judd tied his hands behind his back. Ruth took a handkerchief soaked in chloroform and pressed it against Albert's nose and mouth. They wrapped a picture frame wire around his neck and tried to strangle him. Judd first said, "I am pretty sure it must have been tied by her. I don't know whether it was around his neck or not. This I don't recall." Judd would later say that he was so drunk that he wasn't sure what he did or when, saying, "My movements that particular night are rather indefinite in my own mind. She asked me if he was dead, and I said I didn't think so. I started to mess up the room, and she asked me to put some wire around his neck. I did try to help her, but I was so shaky and intoxicated that I couldn't." Regardless of the version that you believe, Albert would soon lose consciousness and sometime over the next few hours die in his bed. After the effects of the alcohol wore off, Judd found himself covered in Albert's blood. Ruth's negligee was also dripping in her husband's blood. Ruth and Judd went down to the basement where they removed their clothes and burned them in the furnace. Ruth put on a new nightgown and gave Judd one of Albert's blue shirts from the dresser drawer to change into. According to their plan, the murder had to look like a burglary. Judd checked the rope on Albert's wrist to make sure they were secure. He emptied the contents of the dresser onto the floor. They scattered other items around the room. Ruth took all of her jewelry, placed it in a bag, and shoved it in between the mattress and the box spring. Judd then tied up Ruth, bounding her ankles with rope and tying her hands loosely behind her back. He put some cheesecloth in her mouth and covered her with a fur coat. He took 2 drinks from a bottle and told Ruth, "It may be 2 months, it may be a year, and it may be never before you see me again." They kissed each other, and Judd slipped out through a side door and walked to the bus stop. He would later board a subway to Grand Central to wait for the 8:45 train to Syracuse. Meanwhile, back at the Snyder home, Ruth and Albert's daughter was waking up from a tapping she was hearing on the wall. Although still groggy from being out with her parents that night before, she could hear someone calling her name, so she woke up to investigate. When she walked into her parents' bedroom, she saw her mom tied up and screamed, "Mommy, Mommy, what happened?" Ruth had Lorraine untie her, and they ran to the neighbor's house to call the police. Quickly, the Snyder home was filled with uniformed officers, crime scene investigators, and detectives. When police started to search the home, they found a phone book with the name H. Judd Gray in it that Ruth admitted belonged to her. They found all of Ruth's jewelry that she hid under the mattress the night before. As protocol, police brought Ruth in for questioning. This would be the start of her idiotic plan unraveling. Police asked, "Do you know this Judd Gray?" To which Ruth replied, "No, I've never heard of him." This was obviously the first red flag for police because they were confused as to why she would have a name and phone number of a person she's never heard of in her address book. Ruth went on to give her version of events, and they went as follows. After arriving home from the party that evening, Albert went straight to bed, and Ruth followed shortly thereafter. A little while later, Ruth heard footsteps. Believing it was her daughter Lorraine, she got up to investigate. When she entered the hallway, a stranger threw her down on the mattress, and that's the last thing she remembers, other than that the stranger sounded foreign to her. Not surprisingly, though, this story did not coincide with the evidence found at the crime scene. Police had never seen a burglar search an entire house, including the couch. When the medical examiner checked Ruth in her living room, there were no cuts or bruises on her head, despite claiming to have been knocked unconscious for several hours. While Albert's wallet had been emptied by the burglars, Ruth's jewelry was left undisturbed. But most telling was the missing pillowcase that police found in the hamper covered in blood. When asked, Ruth had no explanation for these findings and even passed out several times during questioning. During the interrogation, police took a chance and tried one of the oldest tricks in the book and told Ruth that Judd Gray was already in custody and that he admitted to the murder. Rolling the dice quickly paid off for police because Ruth changed her story. And although she only admitted to helping plan the ambush and not the actual murder, it was at least a starting point for police. Detectives called for a court stenographer to type up a detailed statement from Ruth that they would later have her sign. During her statement to police, she told them that after the murder, Judd went to Grand Central Station to board a train to Syracuse. Up until this point, police didn't even know for sure that Judd was even involved in the murder. Unbeknownst to Ruth, Commissioner Laughlin dispatched Lieutenants Brown and McDermott to Syracuse. Less than 18 hours after the discovery of Albert's body, Brown and McDermott were on their way to the Onondaga Hotel, where Ruth had let them know that Judd had reserved a room. About 12:30 a.m., there was a knock at the door. "Mr. Gray, it's the police. We'd like to ask you a few questions about Albert Snyder." "I don't know anything about it," Judd said through a closed door. "We'd like to talk to you anyway." Reluctantly, Judd opened the door and let the men in. They informed Mr. Gray of Albert Snyder's death and asked him to accompany them back to New York City. At first, Judd refused, stating that he had never even met Albert Snyder and only knew Ruth through a mutual friend. He completely treated the situation as some sort of joke or misunderstanding, but eventually agreed to go back to New York City with the detectives. A short time after arriving at the New York City police station, Judd resigned to his guilt and began to give a detailed confession. He informed them of his sexual obsession for Ruth, his compulsive need for her approval, and rapid descent into murder. He spared no details and described how he murdered Albert Snyder with his bare hands in great detail. He did not spare Ruth either, though, exposing her complicity, manipulation, and influence in the murder of her husband. Judd would see Ruth as the cause of his deterioration, the reason he committed murder, and the reason for his demise, telling detectives, "I would never have killed Snyder but for her. She has this power over me. She told me what to do, and I just did it." Later that day, he was brought to the office of the district attorney, where he repeated his confession and signed a formal complaint. Ruth was brought to the office of the district attorney at the Long Island City Courthouse as well, where she also gave a full statement. Within 4 days after their arrest, Ruth and Judd would find themselves in front of a Queens grand jury on trial for the murder of Albert Snyder. There were 8 witnesses subpoenaed to testify that included Albert's brother, Warren Snyder, the two police officers that responded to the murder scene, and Emily Coulis, the stenographer that recorded the confessions of Ruth and Judd. Assistant medical examiner Dr. Howard testified about Albert's injuries and cause of death. Hayden Gray, one of Judd's closest friends, testified about Judd's movements the day after the murder, stating that Judd asked him to help support a fictitious alibi for him. He admitted to going into Judd's room at the Onondaga Hotel on March 21st and messing up the bed to make it look like someone had slept there. He went on to admit that he made several phone calls from the hotel room and placed a "Do Not Disturb" sign on the door. It was also made public that 1 year before Albert's death, Ruth took out a life insurance policy on Albert in the amount of $52,000. She also added a clause that if Albert should die accidentally, which included murder, the payout would double. Once their confessions were submitted to the court, Ruth and Judd were indicted on first-degree murder charges. After they were charged, Ruth quickly changed her story, claiming that the entire confession was a lie. She goes on to say the only reason for giving the false confessions were as follows. "They treated me brutally and worked me to death. They gave me nothing to eat until yesterday. They worked me into a state where I would say anything to have them leave me alone." On April 25, 1927, District Attorney Richard Newcomb gives his opening statements to the jury, claiming that neither Ruth or Judd deserved mercy because the murder of Albert was cruel and premeditated, on top of which they staged the scene to look like a burglary. He went on to read the statements given by Ruth and Judd aloud to the jury. Police Commissioner Laughlin also took the stand to testify that he interviewed both defendants after the murder. Ruth was calm and composed during her interview. He testifies that Judd had a remarkable memory and was able to recall the tiniest of details. Ruth's written statement was then read aloud to the court. On April 29, 1927, Ruth Snyder took the stand to testify. Ruth testifies that although she took part in the murder, she also tried to save her husband. She testifies that she was terrified of Judd and had no choice but to participate in the murder, saying, "I was mortally afraid of him. I saw what a terrible man he was. I couldn't see any other way out than to what he asked me to do." Eventually, when the subject got around to insurance policies on Albert's life, Ruth became more guarded and was unable to escape the obvious. The prosecution asked, "Do you know any reason on earth why Judd Gray would want to kill Albert Snyder?" To which Ruth replies, "Yes, for the insurance that he was after." "Was there any insurance policy made with Judd Gray as the beneficiary?" "No." "Who was the beneficiary?" To which Ruth replies, "I was." Judd's testimony was no better. He extended answers to all questions, proving that he did indeed have a remarkable memory. When he started to give details of their first passionate adventure, Ruth lifted her head and opened her eyes wide in horror. Apparently, she thought that he would lie for her. When it came time to describe the murder of Albert, Judd described Ruth as leading the way. When it came time to describe the murders, he told the court, quote, "She took me by the hand and led me down the hall. I struck him on the head as near as I could see, one blow. Then I hit him, another blow. He raised up and started to holler. I was on top of him. He grabbed me by the tie. I hollered, 'Momsy, Momsy, for God's sake, help me.' She took the weight and hit him over the head." During closing statements, one of Ruth's attorneys, Dana Wallace, said Judd deserved no mercy. "This miserable filth of the earth is allowed to sit here, and before he makes his squealing appeal for mercy to you, he has defamed this woman, calling him a diabolical fiend and a human anaconda." Going on to say, "There is the most despicable man that has ever walked God's footstool as far as I have known men." Judd's attorney was no better when he attacked Ruth, telling the jury a sinister, fascinating woman came across his path. What a catastrophe. That woman, that peculiar creature, like a poisonous snake, like a poisonous serpent, drew Judd Gray into her glistening coils, and there was no escape. On May 9th at 7:04 p.m., the jury went back to their room to deliberate. After only 2 hours of deliberation, they had reached a verdict. Ruth and Judd were found guilty of murder in the first degree and were given the death penalty. Ruth was housed at Sing Sing prison and was the first female to face execution in New York since Mary Farmer in 1909. On the day Ruth was admitted, 14 men were on death row and 9 men had already been executed that year. Ruth and Judd sat on death row for the remainder of 1927. On the morning of Ruth's execution, hundreds of people gathered outside the gates of Sing Sing prison. 24 witnesses, reporters, and prison officials awaited the arrival of the condemned. Sitting in the front row was a photographer named Thomas Howard, who was hired by the Daily Mail for this assignment. Photographic equipment was forbidden by the warden, but Howard was able to smuggle in a camera that was taped to his ankles. Finally, the door swings open and in walks Ruth Snyder, wearing a brown smock over a dark green skirt and slippers. Reporters that had known her from the trial were shocked. She had gained 40 pounds, her shapely body had become shapeless, and her blonde hair was lifeless, straight, and unkempt. Father John, the Catholic chaplain, held a crucifix in front of her while she prayed loudly. Ruth then made her way over to the chair. "Father, forgive them," Ruth cried over and over. "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." The matrons helped Ruth to the chair and quietly strapped her into her seat. A loud crackling filled the room. 2,000 volts of electricity shot through Ruth's body at lightning speed. Pressed violently against the restraining straps as if to break free. A sizzling noise, much like a steak on a grill, was heard from behind the chair, and then the onlookers were hit with the horrid smell. Ruth's neck and arms turned a deep crimson red. After 2 minutes, the power to the chair was turned off. A few seconds later, the power was turned back on. This would be repeated 2 more times. Dr. Charles Sweet briefly examined her and then shouted loudly, "I declare this woman dead." Moments later, at 11:17 p.m., guards brought Judd Gray into the execution room. Judd was placed in the chair and the electrodes were connected to his head and leg. The guards then flipped the switch on and a loud hum filled the room. Judd's body stiffened in the chair and blue smoke seemed to come from the back of his head. At 11:19 p.m., Dr. Sweet pronounced Judd Gray dead, and the guards quickly removed him from the chair. And with that, the Snyder Gray case was over. If you guys are still here, I'm sending you 1 million thank yous. I appreciate you more than you know. Please leave me a like and a comment. Please subscribe. If you could, please leave me some case suggestions down below. It would be so greatly appreciated. Until next time, guys.